Okay, I am going to welcome you all to this webinar. My name is Judy Houston. I'm the chair of the Religious Affairs Committee of the NAACP Boulder County. And so I'm going to give you some technical details and introduce our wonderful panelists and moderator. And we'll hope we are a bunch of people who haven't hosted a webinar before, so we hope that we do this without too many wrinkles. So the first thing that you may be wondering about is whether, why you can't see yourself and why you can't like chat amongst each other and that sort of thing. And that is because in the interest of keeping this as simple as possible for all the attendees and especially for the panelists and moderator, we have changed how that all works so that you really can't, you won't be able to chat as an attendee, you won't be able to see each other's Q&A, and you won't be able to have your video shown at all. So if you have any tech questions, you can use the Q&A, which should be down at the, it depends on what your device is, but there should be a Q&A thing down at the bottom or on the side or under more on your screen. And that is where you can ask technical questions. And then when it comes to the point where we're at asking for audience participation in the form of asking questions of the panelists, you can use that Q&A for that as well. So we'll be monitoring both for technical questions and then also for questions. I'm going to ask right now that the panelists mute yourselves until we have a chance to, until it's time for the panelists to begin. Okay. Thank you. And also Neil and Gabby to mute. I guess I can mute you. Okay. Yeah, welcome. And let's see if there's anything else I need to say. Once again, that the chat is not usable or visible to attendees except as sent out by the panelists. And that will include tech people or support people. So if something comes up in the in the chat, that's going to mean that we're trying to communicate to everybody about something in particular. Okay. I would like to welcome our panelists, and they're going to have a greater in-depth introduction after a bit. But so the panelists are Dr. Sheila Davis, if you want to raise your hand, thank you. And Minister Glenda Robinson. Okay, and Dr. Thomas Mays. Wonderful, and pardon us while we figure out how to spotlight people. There you are, Dr. Thomas. And our amazing moderator, Dr. Michele Simpson. And I'm going to give a little bio for Michele. So Michele is an associate teaching professor in philosophy, arts, and culture residential program at CU Boulder. She's a faculty affiliate and research associate with the Renee Crown Wellness Institute. She's also a faculty member of the Student Academic Success Center, the Honors Residential Academic Program, and the Program for Excellence in Academics in Community. And most recently, Michele has become a faculty affiliate of the Center for African and African American Studies, otherwise known as CAS. As a professor, Michele's courses reflect her passion and commitment to topics including anti-racism, anti-Blackness, social justice, and the exploration of the intersections that inform myriad lived experiences. Her more current course offerings have included gender, sexuality, and popular culture, ethical puzzles and moral conflicts, and sacred spaces. At the Renee Crown Wellness Institute, Michele is honored to be the principal investigator of Girls Like Us, a program research study focused on the lives and experiences of Black girls in Boulder County. She is also a member of the Mindful Campus team and holds myriad roles as curriculum co-creator and Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Affinity Group co-facilitator. She's also a contributing member to the Compassion and Dignity for Educators project. Michele is the host and producer of Black Talk, a co-creation of the Boulder County NAACP and Boulder Public Radio's KGNU. Black Talk, a monthly program, centers Black voices, thought, and vision, acknowledging and honoring the diversities amongst Black communities. The show features a wide range of guests and topics. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Michele.
Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our afternoon discussion of this book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. This is a book written by Heather McGhee, and some of you may have known Heather McGhee when she was the president of Demos. Demos is considered a liberal think tank, and she was president and served as president from 2014 to 2018. She is now considered an expert in economic and social policy, and she's also chair of the board of directors of Color of Change, and some of you may be members of Color of Change. Color of Change is the nation's largest online racial justice organization. So I thought we'd hold introductions for a moment, but we would dive in with a question. And the question I wanted to ask has to do with our panel and has to do with all of us being here today. So again, let's hold introductions for a moment and try to set the tone for today's discussion with the following. So panelists, welcome. Hi there, everyone. So I absolutely know this for certain. I know that each of you has sat on other panels. You've been asked to respond to various questions from time to time around the latest racialized debacle, whether that be national, regional, local, perhaps at your workplace. And the question that arises for me is why? So why did you say yes when asked to sit on today's panel? And the second part of that question is, what is your hope for today's discussion? Because I see those as twin endeavors. So A, why did you say yes when asked to sit on today's panel? And what is your hope for today's discussion? And I'd like to begin with you, Dr. Davis.
Well, thank you. And it's great to be here with all of you. So I have been doing this work as my fellow panelists and others in the audience for a long time, for several decades. And every time a new book comes out, I'm always skeptical. I'm like, well, what hasn't been said about racism in this country? But I am usually blown away. When the 1619 Project came out, I was completely blown away because it really reframes our country's history, and it centers 1619, which is the date that the first slave ship arrived in Jamestown. Then Ibram X. Kendi's book came out. Once again, I was blown away. And then The Sum of Us came out, and I was skeptical. And I was once again blown away because it offers this really granular analysis of how policies, both formal and informal processes and procedures in a whole host of areas, have contributed to the divides, the racial divides that we see. And one statistic completely blew me away, and I'm going to go nerdy on you. I was a university professor, so I can't help it. They say that, and I know that I'm being timed, that white Christians are about 30 percentage points more likely to hold racially resentful and otherwise racist views when religiously non-affiliated white people, according to a new analysis. Wow, 30%. So it is so deeply baked into the American version of Christianity, which is not a monolith. And so my hope is that we walk away with the beginning of some kind of exploration of how Christian churches have been complicit in slavery and white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Davis. How about you, Pastor Mays?
Yes, thank you. And I'm excited just to be here today. I accepted this call or this request to serve on the panel because it's about me. It's about my life. It's about my children, my grandchildren, my greats that are to come. It involves all of us. And the book, The Sum of Us, it means that we're in this together. Mm-hmm. And so I want to make sure I play my part. I don't want to take anything to the grave with me. I'd like to make sure we get out of this today. I'll lean towards the pastor side of me. One man plants, another one waters, and God gives increase. I would love to see us plant some seeds or accept some seeds that will cause us to grow in knowledge and understanding of where we're at when we're talking about the sum of us, where we're at, where the racial divide is concerned, where we're at and what role we can play to better educate one another on how we can be instrumental in bringing about this change. So that's my purpose for being here and my desire.
No, thank you so much. Minister Glenda, you are on.
Thank you. Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. And I'm always delighted when asked to share some of the experiences that I have had. This book is actually, as Dr. May said, this is my life. I grew up through the civil rights movement from the death of Emmett Till all the way up to the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so I so resonated with so many, with her story and the highlights of other people's stories that she did. And so I'm always delighted and honored to share with the general public that freedom is not free. It was paid for by the lives of many people whom I knew. We're talking about rights to vote, and we're talking about basic human rights. And of course, we all know that Dr. King's last deed on earth, we were marching for the rights of garbage men, garbage workers. And so I'm always delighted to share my story, and that coupled with this incredible book, hopefully will take us somewhere and somewhere positive. We've been down this road many times before. Thank you.
Well, Ms. Glenda, stay there for a moment. Stay there for a moment. So now that you've shared your hopes for today's discussion, might I ask you to take a few minutes to tell us about yourself?
Okay, gladly. Yes, my name is Glenda Strong Robinson. I was born in, I always say, the segregated Jim Crow South. And the reason that's significant is because what Jim Crow meant was that we were not allowed, well, the whole premise was separate but equal. But if anybody knows anything about that, we know that we were very much separate and very much unequal. I went to segregated schools. We were not allowed to go to the parks, the pools, the libraries, the fair, the zoo. We went to the zoo on one day a month. I think it was Thursdays, may have been Tuesdays. But what's significant about that now also is that those were Jim Crow laws. We're now trying to get laws about voting and voting restrictions under the guise of voter integrity. But we really know if we had the most successful election in 2020 that we've had in many years, we know that voter integrity, really, anyhow. And so these things, we were marching and protesting for that. I grew up in just north of Memphis, Tennessee, in the country. We picked cotton, we chopped cotton, we grew everything that we had, and we lived on a farm, and we were not allowed. I can't say it enough. Jim Crow laws restricted us from interacting with our neighbors even. And so, you know, and we're going back to that. I grew up in a family that was a very loving Christian family. My great-grandparents were enslaved, but they were church planters and church founders. And in fact, the church that my family went to this morning was founded by them and by my grandfather. And so that Christian tradition is just all in my life and my family. And we grew up saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The tragedy about that is we've seen even the church, the general Christian church, say one thing and do another. Anyhow, so that's, I grew up, and then I went to Lane College and HBCU. So excited because all my 6 siblings before me had gone there.
Glenda, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to make certain we have enough time to get around to those introductions. So hold that thought. Hold that thought at Lane College. Hold that thought at Lane College. And let's try to circle back around to that because we want to hear. You know, we'd love to hear those experiences as well, but I want to make certain we get to Pastor Mays as well. Okay, so hold that thought. Pastor Mays, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm a native Denverite, a Vietnam veteran. I pastor Living Water Christian Center. I'm the president of the Greater Metro Denver Ministerial Alliance and the third vice president for the NAACP for Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Those are a few of my hats that I wear. I also author of the book, The Brilliance of Ignorance. I was born and raised in Denver, went to a predominantly white elementary school, predominantly Black junior high and high school. So that is a little bit about my background. I work closely with the Aurora Police Department, the issues that's going on even now with the police chief hiring. Those are some of the things I've worked with. I've been pastoring since 1990, and that's when I really started my venture out into the community activist position that I hold. Worked closely with several things. We boycotted the Aurora Mall, which is now the Aurora Town Center, to get our first African-American manager there at that mall. I've worked closely with the Victims Witness Advisory Board for the Aurora Police Department as well. I am married for 43 years, be 44 years come February. The father of 4 children, 3 girls and a son, 8 grandchildren, and God has blessed me to spend some time really trying to unload everything God has placed in me here on the face of the earth before I meet him in the air. I don't want to take anything to the grave with me. So that's a little bit about who I am. And hopefully I will get to know many of you as we continue on. God bless.
Thank you, Pastor Mays. Thank you for that. Okay, Dr. Davis.
I am the daughter of a Shirley Chisholm delegate. My mother supported Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African-American Afro-Caribbean woman to run for president from a major political party. So I was raised by activists. I decided to go to medical school. There's several physicians in my family. And I noticed the racism. I noticed the racism that was held by providers. I noticed institutional racism. And I also saw the difference in health outcomes for people of color versus the white population. And I also noticed how the social determinants impacted the health conditions of people of color. I attended medical school in Philadelphia, and I noticed that my patients from West Philadelphia that lived next to oil refineries were the ones that were the sicker patients that I had. And after I completed my pediatric internship, I decided I was invited to serve on one of the Healthy People Progress Reviews, which is a report card on the health status of the nation. And I looked at the data and it confirmed my experiences and the differences in life expectancy between African Americans and the white population was on the order of 20 years. And I was so upset that I joined the movement to achieve health equity. I haven't looked back. I will go into details later. But I most recently, I was working for the governor. I was the director of the Office of Health Equity.
Okay. Well, Dr. Davis, thank you. And all three panelists, thank you again for joining us today. I wanted to remind everyone who is participating in today's webinar, I wanted to remind you what Judy said at the outset. We invite your questions. Please be reminded, though, that the chat has been disabled. So questions must be submitted through the Q&A. You should be able to view the Q&A icon from your screen. Now, I'll say this, we may not be able to capture and pose all of the questions that may arise. However, we will absolutely do our best, okay? So we will ask you in advance to be patient with us on this end. One of the things that I did want to say before we move into the next question, I just wanted to synopsize just a bit of what we find in The Sum of Us, what racism costs everyone, and how, again, we can prosper together. And one of the main premises, it's not the only, and we'll try to kind of hit many of them, but one of the main premises of this particular book is, and it happens early in the book. Early in the book, the author, Heather McGhee, uses the metaphor of the drained swimming pool. And as many of you may know, in the early part of the 20th century, as a testament to public investment and civic pride, American towns constructed swimming pools. Okay, and these weren't constructed only in the South. All right, swimming pools were constructed all throughout the country. However, then desegregation happened, and the pools were required by law to be integrated. So rather than open them up to everyone, that is Black folks, town after town simply shut them down. Both my mom and dad were born and raised in Montgomery, Alabama. And in Montgomery, for example, not only did they close the pools, they sold off the animals and closed the zoo to avoid being in the presence of Black men, women, and children. So a question that might arise, and it would be an obvious question, did that hurt members of the Black community? Absolutely. Absolutely. But the question raised, and the question raised in The Sum of Us again and again and again is, but who else did it hurt? Who else did it hurt? So if we apply this metaphor to political circumstances, Heather McGhee really reaches the conclusion that America has become one giant drained pool. Again, America has become one giant drained pool. So when we consider racism, Black people are typically cast as the victims. And what is true is Black people have been excluded. Black folks have been pushed to the margins, physically, mentally, and emotionally harmed, injured, and in too many instances killed as a result of racial oppression and white supremacy. So what Heather McGhee puts forward in the book is the fact that white people pay an immense price for the country's racial hierarchy. And she suggests that most white people don't even realize it. She references it as an essentially self-inflicted wound. So my question to our panelists is thus: do you agree with Ms. McGhee's premise? And if you do, tell us why. If you don't, tell us why. And can you share something from your lived experience that supports her assertion? And again, that assertion being that white supremacy, kind of racism, is essentially a self-inflicted wound. So I will ask that question first and direct it to you, Pastor Mays. So what are your thoughts?
You know, I agree with her wholeheartedly. It's sad the price that we've paid. One of the greatest, if not the greatest country in the world, for us to be where we are. We shouldn't be. The homeless, the economy, the loss of life during COVID. with the technology we have, we should have been so far ahead of so many things. But yes, it's a self-inflicted wound. My mother was Spanish. My mother's Spanish. My father is African American. And during our time, I remember riding in our station wagon, a 1962 Chevy station wagon with the seat facing backwards. And we were headed to Oklahoma from Colorado. My father pulled into a filling station to get some gas behind another car, a white gentleman in front of us. And they got their gas. We pulled up to the tank, and my father did not even look up. He was taught to not look white men in the eyes. So he just said, would you fill it up with regular? And I remember even as a small child hearing the attendant say, "We don't have any gas, boy." I didn't understand it then, but I knew we were almost out of gas because I could hear mom and dad talking. We went ahead and pulled off. Sure enough, we ran out of gas. My dad had to walk, I don't know how many miles. I remember my mother keeping us singing gospel songs while he was walking to try to get some gas. And it wasn't until I was a young adult and my dad, we revisited that incident. And my father said to me, and I asked him basically, why didn't you explain these things to me while I was younger? And he told me, I wanted you to understand these things for yourself. But he said, I think the problem is what he didn't understand, our skin color was different, but our money color were the same. And he didn't hurt me alone. He hurt himself because that was green dollars he could have put in his pocket and it would have been advantageous to him. But he was willing to hurt himself in order to hurt me or to avoid me being a part of the economy. And he says, all our money is the same color. And he taught me, and especially in that I attended an all-white elementary school, I understood. I didn't even understand discrimination until I got to the black school, and I found out that's why they were doing this to me. Those are the things that occurred to me, and I was naive to that. So what the author has said in this book definitely is true. It's almost like the story of the raccoon who reached his hand in a jar to grab something shiny, and rather than turn it loose to get his hand out, he held on to it and was handicapped because of the jar, almost chewed his own arm off because he would not turn it loose, that shiny thing. And I think the Anglo-Saxon, the white man, has held on to success at the detriment of himself. And he's been caught in a trap that has really hurt our country so much because he's not willing to turn it loose to pull his hand out of the trap. And the trap has been that segregation, that separatism, that discrimination, the inequity. It's a trap that America has caught itself in and doesn't understand. If you just release what you think is so precious to you, the economy, the power, the control, if you release it long enough, we all can be so much better.
Mm-hmm. Pastor Mays, thank you so much. Minister Glenda.
Yes, ma'am. Oh my gosh, I have so many stories that I could share, but I'll try to be restrictive. Gosh, Pastor Mays, I appreciate that story. You know, my mother used to say something like, sometimes we cut off our nose to spite our faces. And so I think this is just what has happened when a whole group of people decides that we're going to shut everything down and we're not going to let anybody participate in that. Of course, we all lose. I thought of a couple of things. The one thing that sticks out in my mind, when I left Lane, I was only there for one semester. My dad said during Christmas break that he could not afford to have me continue to go there, but they were taking coloreds now at Memphis State, and you got to go there because there was no question that we would stop education on any level. He knew that was the ticket. So when I went I enrolled at Memphis State, I was in this history class And what's funny about that is I serve as historian on 2 different planes right now, and also working with the historical museum at Boulder. But I had this professor. There were 55 students in the class, and only a Black guy, Willie Johnson, and myself, Glenda Strong. And the professor gets up before the class, I mean, humiliating, and says, I see you people in here, but I have to tell you this. The most that you can get in my class, that was the 2 Black students, is a C. He says, I know you probably come from the best and brightest in your schools, in your own schools, but my theory and my philosophy is that the most, I don't care how bright they are, the most a colored person can make in my world is a C, because the most that you could ever be is average. And so he, on behalf of that entire history department, saw me, how degrading is that, as only average. I got an F in that class. But as I said, the irony and joke of all of that is I serve as historian at Second Baptist Church Boulder, as well as the NAACP Boulder County. And I'm working on the Proclaiming Colorado's Black History right now, which opens an exhibit that opens in September of 2023. So we all lose. When we look at that, we all lose. The other thing I want to point out is when George Floyd was killed, someone showed up at my front door, a very good friend. I've been here 42 years, and she showed up and she was crying, just all upset. And she said, I had no idea. How can something like this happen? And my first thought was, where have you been? Under a rock or what? But I know that wasn't the case, because she came to my home when we had a nephew killed at the hands of police in 1981 by the chokehold. And so she knew the story. I just didn't get it. And so the point I want to make there is, we can choose as a race or as a whole group of people to be oblivious to those things that are going on around us. When we focus on my 4, no more. We can make those choices here. We can go for a week or a month and not see Black people if we choose to, where I live right here in Longmont. And so it's a heart issue, and it's a people issue, and it's do I want to get involved, or do I choose blindly to isolate myself from these situations that are happening in life? And they're becoming less and less obvious for us to be able to do that.
Minister Glenda, thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. Okay, so Dr. Davis.
Well, I'm delighted to follow Minister Historian Glenda. My mother, the Shirley Chisholm delegate, grew up in Gary, Indiana, and her father was the principal of the all-Black high school in Gary, Indiana. And every summer, new students would come because of the Great Migration to work in the steel mills in Gary and the south side of Chicago. They are contiguous. And because the school was segregated, and because African-American physicists and writers couldn't get jobs at white colleges and universities, this high school employed PhD physicists and writers, etc. And so the students who graduated from this particular high school had the best. had the best and the brightest. I don't know if that would have happened in an integrated high school. And they had a sense of agency that I feel many of our students who are in integrated schools may not get. And so I'm saying all of this to say that your question, there are nuances to your question. So yes, I agree. And something I believe has been lost with integration. Integration in this country is far from perfect. But that, you know, the arc of the universe bends towards justice, and there has been an ingenuity in the African-American community that was born out of segregation. I'm not advocating segregation, but I'd love to have this conversation about what integration, healthy integration would look like.
You know, I want to come back to that. I want to come back to that for a moment because I saw some nodding heads amongst the panelists. So I want to say a few things about that. And it's interesting because, again, having parents who grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, and having spent most of my summers there, and you know, really got to know life in Montgomery, in and around Montgomery. And around our dinner table, we often talked, or my parents did anyway. I was pretty young, but I heard about just the losses, what was lost in terms of integration, that principals lost jobs, teachers lost jobs, businesses went away. In Montgomery, you know, there was a street, as there were in many cities and towns where Black folks lived, that was a business district, and that dried up. And in terms of just that communal aspect of Black life was lost, and many people still mourn that. And so, Pastor Mays, now I know you grew up here, you grew up in Denver, you grew up in Colorado. What was your experience? Because I happen to know that integrating the schools in Colorado, in the Denver metropolitan area, for example, was fraught. Let's put it that way. And so do you have any stories or anything you'd like to share about that time period? And again, just taking off from Dr. Davis's comment regarding integration.
Yes, you know, I was right on the cusp of integration. We moved in 1964 from Globeville, which is North Denver, to Park Hill. At that time, Park Hill was predominantly white, and we were part of that integration. I remember my father bought a what they called blonde brick home, tri-level, and he felt like, you know, we've arrived. We were not accepted in the neighborhood, but he made sure that house was always the finest, upkept yard, so on and so forth. So I experienced that firsthand. But integration hurt us because we didn't understand our freedom, what integration was. My younger sisters, were bused to a different school, to a white school, but our education diminished because when we were at Smiley Junior High School, it was a predominantly Black school when I was there. East High School, predominantly Black when I was there. We had a lot of Black teachers, people who were concerned about the education of Black children. When they started integration, when you had to go to a school where people were by law required to accept you and treat you equal, they cared less about you getting that education. So if you talked in class, if you skipped class, they didn't care because it was hurting you. But we had it and it was segregated where we were all Black, the Black teacher would call your mom, call your dad. Hey, he didn't show up for class. He's not getting his grades. It's hurting it that they get their grades. They've got to do that. They must They must excel in these areas because they're expected to fail. They're expected to lose. There's challenges they're going to have to face. And if they don't have an education, they're not going to survive. So we were concerned about our own. When integration came in, yes, it hurt us quite a bit because then we were bused to schools where the people really could care less whether we were educated or not. But instead, they would give us tools that we thought was good for us, were actually detrimental to us. Much like even now, when African Americans are incarcerated at a large, it's such a disparity there. But I've talked to so many African American young men who get out quick, get out early. Oh, we're having a party, I'm out of jail. And they didn't realize what they were using was a 3-strike rule. They knew you didn't have survival tools once you came out. So they gave you an early out. You had no way, no support system to survive. You end up back in. And after 3 times, hey, you're a career criminal. So those type of traps, the welfare, which we thought was really good during integration, it was a tool that was detrimental to the Black family because then they were getting a handout, not a hand up. They could do that only if the man was not in the home. So men left their families and it evolved into so many fatherless homes. So integration hurt us in a lot of ways, because no one loves us like we love ourselves.
No, well, thank you for that, Pastor Mays. Dr. Davis, I see your hand up.
I don't want to take airtime from Minister Glenda, but I want to say that I think that what's missing when we talk about integration is access to opportunity. And that was never factored in, when you talk about welfare and other programs. And so what does access to opportunity look like? And now I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. You did that so fast. You're very smooth there, Dr. Davis. So Minister Glenda.
She baited us.
Yes, Minister Glenda, if you wanted to chime in, please do.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, integration was a little before my time in the public school sector, except that my brother, who is now 92 years old, or he's gonna be 92 in May, but he was the youngest principal at that time in Shelby County of the largest high school in Shelby County during integration. I guess that was 71, 72, but check this out. Brown versus Board of Education was, the law was 54, 55, 56, Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP, which is my issue with states' rights, because the bottom line is everybody knows that every state can do whatever they want to do. This is why we're trying to go all the way back there. But my oldest brother, John, was principal of Woodstock High School in Shelby County, Tennessee. And they reduced all of the just flourishing high schools, Black high schools, to elementary schools. And the forced busing was that you had to go to Bolton or Millington Central, the big flourishing white schools. What also happened was that the younger, the teacher situation, in the all Black schools, we had teachers who cared, as everyone has said. They cared for you. They called your mama if you acted up. If you did, great. We had a relationship. It was literally the beloved community, as Dr. King always said. But once integration happened, they sent the worst teachers, the worst white teachers, to the Black schools. And they sent the best and brightest teachers, Black and white, to the white schools. That's what we saw, and that's what we knew. And so you talk about, you take the take the best of the best and you give them that advantage, and then you take the worst of the worst. It's still a message. It's a message that there is a group of people that does not quite measure up. You just can't quite do it. Just like the man told me, as I don't care if you're a genius and you're Black. In my eyes, you're average and below. That's how I see this. And he's not the only, he probably represents the average person, the average white person, as we look over this scheme of racism.
Mm-hmm. Listening to all of your stories reminds me of my mom and my dad, who went to a Catholic school in Montgomery, Alabama, as I've stated before, and how the nuns, who were white, would tell them that they were poor students and that they weren't as smart as the white students in the Catholic school across town, because of course schools were segregated. So, when you talk about kind of the nature of the education that was received and the messages that we got. Heather McGhee, throughout the book, tells the story of zero sum. Okay, the idea that white people perceive a massive dividing line between Black people and themselves. We're viewed as being on opposite teams. And so progress for Black people and people of color, it's perceived, this is a perception, has come or will come at the expense of white people. And so I wanted to talk about that because it's really a central theme. So what is your reaction to that premise? And again, would you be so kind as to include any examples from your own experience? And I keep asking for examples from your own experience because I think it makes some of these concepts, these ideas that were put forward by the author a little less abstract. And she does a great job of providing stories throughout. But since we're not reading the book right this second, I think we could really benefit from your stories and experiences. So Dr. Davis, would you start us off?
So the question is, where has the zero sum been unfulfilled? Is how I'm hearing you, or to what extent has zero sum been my reality, or it has not been my reality? Is that what am I getting the right, am I interpreting this right?
Yeah.
Wow. That's a big question. So, zero sum is a belief, and it has no truth to it. I just want to state that, and she states that as well, that this is nothing, that it's fiction. And so I would say that my life has defied this whole zero sum myth. I've lived all over the country. My early years were in outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and then we moved to Minneapolis, and I integrated schools there. And the idea that people, that there is this, there are these two teams, it really never materialized. And I have a feeling, but the thing is that I lived in communities that were more progressive. Mm-hmm. And so, it was possible for my mother to become a Shirley Chisholm delegate because the Democratic Party in Minnesota wanted, they were all about integration. And had I grown up in Mississippi, where they cling to, I shouldn't say, okay. Some people cling to the zero sum. I see a lot of evidence of it in Mississippi. Then it's their reality. But I had the advantage of growing up in places where people did not cling to the zero-sum thought. And so I had a lot of opportunities. So I really think that and one of my takeaways from this book was, in the United States is really, I don't know, a country of I don't know how many different regions. And your experience, I mean, there is something universal, there's an anti-Blackness certainly that is alive and well in the United States. But there are regions in the country that are moving away from the zero sum faster than other regions.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Pastor Mays, what are your thoughts?
You know, I don't, I look at that zero sum in a, from my perspective, you don't have, you're going to hurt yourself. You're not, because of what you take from me, it's not going to make you have more. I went to, as I said earlier, a predominantly white elementary school. And that was in the late 50s, early 60s. When they would partner us off to do projects in class, they'd put in couples. And when it usually would come down, I would, of course, be the last one. And if there was not another Black child or a Hispanic child that I could be with, rather than put me with a white child, they would put that last white child with another couple, and there'd be 3 working on a project, and I would work the project by myself.
Mm-hmm.
They thought by putting me with a white child, it would take away from that white child, because they thought I was inferior in thought, in mind, in capabilities, and aptitude. Therefore, they would put them with them. They thought it would hurt me, but in all actuality, because I didn't know discrimination, because I was naive to what they were doing, I thought to myself, they must think that I can do as much as 3 children because they let me do this project by myself. Therefore, I would work extremely hard to ensure that my project was second to none. What it did was cause me to push myself. So in all actuality, it was to my advantage. And I didn't know it at that time. So much so that when I got ready to go to from 2nd grade to 3rd grade, they skipped 3rd grade and put me in 4th grade. And I was happy. My parents were happy because, oh, wow, I was excelling. But what the white man thought, he is excelling too much where he's at. Let's put him in a position where he can fail. Let's push him into 4th grade and he'll fail there. I did not. I excelled because in my mind, what the head did to me was cause me to think, actually find the trueness of myself, that I was capable of doing anything I wanted to do if I put my mind to it. And what it did was give me the incentive and gave me the push I needed to reach the higher heights that really were in my heart. My great-grandfather was a runaway slave who established a church in Claremont, Oklahoma. And he was one of the men who told me, it doesn't matter the color of your skin. What matters is the color of your heart. And all of our hearts are the same. So when we look at the zero sum, I feel like this, whether it's how you perceive it. You're not going to lose because you give to me. I've learned in giving to someone else, whether it be something material, money, whatever, or just giving them knowledge is going to help me. It's the Barnabas theory that I preach in church. Barnabas never got the big write-ups in the Bible. You don't hear a lot about Barnabas, but he opened the doors for Paul, places Paul would not have been able to go had not Barnabas opened the door, because the people didn't trust Paul, but they trusted Barnabas. So that zero-sum theory is so captivating when you understand it. You begin to dissect it and understand, where do you land in that zero-sum theory? Where exactly are you?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Pastor Mays. So, Minister Glenda, hold on. We have a question. we have a question, and I'm not going to just direct the question at you, Minister Glenda. It'll be for whomever wants to respond, but I don't want to ignore this question. And the question reads as follows. Heather McGhee posits that racial equality is a zero-sum game, which we were just talking about. How do we change the narrative to speak to the issue of integration in a way that holds the value of diverse communities? Again, how do we change the narrative to speak to the issue of integration in a way that holds the value of diverse communities? What are your thoughts about how we get to a narrative that highlights common interests? And parenthetically, they mentioned policy. So what are your thoughts about how we get to a narrative that highlights common interests, policy, that positively benefits everyone? So I will open the door to that question. Whoever wants to take it. Dr. Davis, I see your hand raised high there.
Yes, I love the question, and it goes, and I'm glad that we're having a conversation about wisdom tradition, because, you know, I stated the statistic earlier about how white Christians in this country are more likely to hold racist views than unaffiliated white people in this country. And so I think one way to start is for, as I said it earlier, for churches of all denominations to come together and look at their complicity in embracing, promoting, sustaining, clinging to white supremacist ideals, their complicity in slavery, and having some kind of truth and reconciliation moment, as Heather McGhee recommends. And I think that's where you begin, because if, you know, at the church, you're getting these messages about zero sum, then that's a problem, because the New Testament is not about zero sum. So I think starting there would be a great place to start. And I'm grateful that I am on with two other pastors.
No, well, thank you. Thank you. All right. I want to raise another question, and because I don't want to lose our questioners out there. And I'm really glad that people are not only developing their questions, but feeling comfortable submitting them. So we have another question. What resonated most for me in Heather McGhee's book, and I can't stop thinking about it, is how intergenerational poverty works, systemic racism, and worked. And the submitter provides examples like the GI Bill, housing, college, Social Security, et cetera, and how its opposite, intergenerational privilege, has worked for white people. I'm interested in what the panelists think of reparations and ideas about how that would work. How do we even begin to right that wrong? So who might want to tackle the question regarding reparations?
I would love to tackle
Okay, 'cause I
that.
was about to say, if nobody raises their hands, remember I'm a teacher. I'll just call on somebody. So Pastor Mays, jump in.
Well, you know, when you think of reparations, you think about how you're going to do it. And I think one of our problems, I'll put it like that, is we look at reparations as just money. And it's not just money. Certainly that's one of the elements, but opportunity is what I look at reparations. Are you able to give us opportunity to be successful, to be all that we can be? That means we have a lot of small, for instance, small African-American businesses. They cannot take the large contracts. They always take the subcontracts. Someone's going to get the contract. We get the subcontracts. How can we turn that around? And I don't believe that can happen. And go back to the first part of that question. I don't believe that can happen until we understand our history, not just learn our history. Learning our history is just the beginning, but we have to understand how that happened, why those things happened, And you have to go back so far to do that. So I look at the critical race theory, which to me is just history. But the critical race theory, we have to be able to have positive criticism and not the negative criticism. We can't play the blame game. How did this happen? How can we avoid it from happening again? How can we do things differently in order that we might obtain a different outcome? So if we're going to look at reparations, how are we going to do that without getting into the same thing and just have reverse discrimination?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pastor Mays. Minister Glenda.
Yes.
I know you have something to say. I just do. I just feel it telepathically. Mm-hmm.
I just have so much, so many things running inside my head. I don't have any definite thoughts about reparations per se. I agree with Dr. Mays, as he said, but we got a whole race of people, many of whom are traumatized. Talk about PTSD and all of the things that we've lived through and seen and endured just to belong, just to be here. And I mean that I use that word belong loosely because so many people don't know where they belong. And so it's a complex issue. And it takes me back to, I'm sorry, I may be skipping over, but it takes me back to my days with Dr. King, who really preached love. Talking about darkness can't drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate can't drive out hate, only love can do that. And so many people, not just Black people, but people, period, are not healthy. We, speaking of the Christian church, there were 2 commandments given. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. On these 2 things, the scripture says, hang everything else. But we are so not healthy enough to pull onto that, because that love that Dr. King talked about that killed him, ironically, is a strength not our own. It's a power greater than us. It's a power and a strength from somebody bigger than you and I. And so we I don't know, I get all tangled up in this Christian thing because it's such an antithesis of itself, if I can say it that way. Yes, I'm a Christian, this and that. And we're talking about a religion that in some instances says one thing and does another, but it's not about that. It's about a relationship with a heavenly Father, from my perspective. And I say all that because my great-grandfather was born in 1824. I just want to jump to that and say he was just celebrated. He and my great-grandmother were celebrated on April 23rd of 2023. Now, they were enslaved people, but with what little they had, they took it and they brought the beloved community together, and they taught farming. They planted the church that our family still has. And they did, I'll say it a different way. They made something out of nothing. And if this God was there with them and good enough for them, then I have to say that he's good enough for me. And so went through a lot of periods of anger and hatred and meanness after the death of Dr. King, had to find my way and had to find this love that he talks about and the Bible talks about and God talks about. Had to find that with myself. And so we got to get ourselves together. I guess what I'm saying, we got to get ourselves right.
Yeah, well,
and
Mhm.
Okay.
No, thank you for sharing that. No, thank you for sharing that. And I didn't mean to stop you, but
No,
wanted to
I'm
make
good.
certain, yeah, wanted to make certain to get to Dr. Davis's hand as well. Mhm.
Yeah, so I'm going to add to Minister Glenda. I love following her. So that's part of why I see truth and reconciliation needing to happen within the Christian church, because there's this white nationalist theme that, in my estimation, has nothing to do with anything in the New Testament,
That's right.
but yet is just, you know, there are a lot of evangelical churches that are embracing this. And so I would love to see various churches really grapple with what does it mean to walk the Christly walk. And it's not just the Christian church, you know, all wisdom traditions need to really come to terms with what it does it mean to be faithful. Because I wanted to talk about this whole trauma. I mean, there is so much trauma, you know, I mean, across racial lines. And when I think, you know, we just had the midterms. And when I think of North Carolina and Sherry Beasley, the justice, losing, you know, if everybody in the African American community had come out and supported her, it might have been a different outcome. And so I feel that there's a sense of despair in some parts of the African American community because of histories of oppression. And part of that also has to be unearthed, transcended. So, you know, truth and reconciliation, I mean, in terms of concrete steps, I think this book, Heather's book, lays out a whole bunch of a lot of concrete steps that can be taken to address truth and reconciliation. Also, Ta-Nehisi Coates's article in the Atlantic, he has a plan for it, but neither really gets at this trauma that I think is holding all people back. So,
You know, we have another question, and Pastor Mays, I see your hand raised, and we'll get to you in a second. I just wanted to raise it, and the question reads as follows. There are good examples, and so again, this writer is saying that good examples have been provided by all three of you in regards to how integration hurt Black communities and discrimination aimed at hurting Black people based on the attitude of the person discriminated against. And this individual would like, and I think this may have been inspired by the book a bit, can we have more examples of how hurting Black people have also hurt white people? Like the draining of the pools, for example, which is one of the initial examples that we see and premises of the Some of Us. So Pastor Mays, I will give you the floor, and I don't know if you wanted to respond to that question specifically or say something else, but we'll take either.
Yes, I had read that question, and yes, that's exactly what I wanted to respond to.
Okay, well,
And give you
wonderful.
a great example. Coming up during the riots of the 60s at the Civil Rights Movement, I lived off of Martin Luther King, which was 32nd Avenue at that time, right at Ivy Street, not far from the Holly Shopping Center and the Dahlia Shopping Center. Both of those shopping centers were destroyed during the riots. And the police department did not stop that riot like they would have had it been in a white area. It didn't just hurt us. First of all, it did hurt us tremendously because those were our shopping centers. We had moved to the Park Hill, taken over Park Hill for the most part, and we had two shopping centers, food shopping centers. We had the Holly Shopping Center and the Dahlia Shopping Center. They looted and burned and destroyed that, and they were allowed to do it. The police department basically withheld any efforts to stop that. It took 50 years, a half a century, before they rebuilt those centers. Now they're not shopping centers with grocery stores, but they're thriving economic giants in that area right now. Can you imagine how much revenue the white establishment lost because those were all owned by whites. We had some African-American entrepreneurs that was paying leases there, and we were building the African-American community. But at the end of the day, the real economic boost was to the white owners. So the white owners lost all of that revenue they could have got for a full half century, 50 years, 50 whole years before they rebuilt that center, rather than rebuild it in the African-American community. It was not until the whites began to move back in, they said, okay, let's try to rebuild that. How can we have urban renewal in that area after 50 years? So look at how much they lost. That's money, that's revenue, that's intelligence. Look at how many African Americans lost their lives that went to their graves with intellect that may have boosted the economy, may have boosted humankind, but they're dead. The richest place in the world is the graveyard because of the mines and the entrepreneurs, all the things that went there prematurely. So yes, it hurt the white community just like it hurt the black. It hurt them tremendously because they're far behind where they could have been. They lost 50 years of economic development because of their refusal to rebuild or to bring urban renewal in those areas because we were there. So I just wanted to share that.
No, Pastor Mays, thank you for sharing that. I wanted to say just a couple of things, and then I'll come right to you, Minister Glenda. We've gotten some recommendations for resources, and one of those recommendations is a book. And I believe what we're going to try to do is pull together or develop some sort of compendium of some of these resources that have been suggested. And the book that has been suggested by one of our attendees today is Compulsory Voting and Black Citizenship. It's a Fordham Law Review article, and it was written by Ekau N. Yanka. I may have completely butchered the name, but you have the title, Compulsory Voting and Black Citizenship. And it looks like the date of that article was November of 2021. So I did want to mention that. In addition, just this whole conversation is getting me thinking about another book that many of you may be familiar with, and it is Ijoma Oluo's book, So You Want to Talk About Race. And one of her lines from that book is that white supremacy is the nation's oldest pyramid scheme. Even those who have lost everything to the scheme are still hanging on, waiting for their turn to cash out. And so when we talk about this zero-sum mentality, I think that that particular line really sums it up in many ways, that white supremacy is the nation's oldest pyramid scheme. Even those who have lost everything to the scheme are still hanging in there, waiting for their turn to cash out. So, Minister Glenda, it looked like you wanted to weigh in, so I wanted to provide you that opportunity.
Okay, thank you. I want to weigh in on what Dr. Mays said. And Dr. King always said that the riots are the voices of the unheard. And it's so when a community explodes or whatever, good, bad, or indifferent, it is because people are frustrated that no one is listening to them. And so, yes, the communities, the centers were burnt down and torn down, but they contended, these people, rioters, contended, we didn't own anything anyway. And what we do know is that somehow, some way, it's going to be rebuilt. And ironically, in the summer of '65, I was in Long Beach, California, to babysit the nephew that was killed. And in the midst of the Watts riots. And so, of course, all of that was torn down. And as Dr. May said, yes, now the community has, it's been rebuilt, it's vital, and it's thriving, and people are doing well. But in that situation, just as to end that, everybody loses. in the situation like that. Everybody loses. And then you ask another question, this latest question. I want to talk about anybody, I don't know if anyone has heard of the Willie Lynch theory, the Willie Lynch letter and the making of a slave. But this was, we're talking about white supremacy. This was the premise and the letter from Willie Lynch in in the 1700s. And the letter contended that if you wanted to control a group of people, slaves is what he said. So it would be Black people. If you wanted to set up a system, he would give you a foolproof way of doing that. And that was in this letter. And so in this letter, he contends that you do some basic things, and that is to get Black folks fighting among themselves and to pit the colors, the lighter people against the Black people. And anyhow, the Willie Lynch letter, the making of a slave, and he said, if you do that, this premise, speaking of white supremacy, because that's where we are, will last you and make you successful for the next 300 years. And we're in those 300 years right now. It's like, get them to turn. Yes,
no, I was just going to say, no, thank you for that. And we've posted the title of the book online so folks can see that. So thank you for raising that. Dr. Davis, I see your hand. I'm going to move to the next question in the hopes that perhaps I can kind of capture whatever it was you were going to say in that. And if not, that's okay. You'll have a moment to respond to whatever has been discussed up to now. So in the book, Heather McGhee alleges that we're in a resurgence of organizing. Okay, this is her premise. She says that many people have experienced a rebirth of civic life. She references what in the book she has called the solidarity dividend. And she says it can only be had. In other words, one can only embrace or partake or benefit from this solidarity dividend through cross-racial organizing. And I wanted to ask you what you think about that. In other words, do you agree? And again, have you seen cross-racial organizing work? And if so, when and how? And I want to just stipulate in that last part of the question. In other words, do you agree and why? And again, if you've seen cross-racial organizing work, if so, when and how? I want to stipulate that I'd really love any experiences you've had here. Okay, so maybe they don't have to necessarily be last week, but here in Colorado, this particular webinar was put together and is being hosted by folks in Boulder County specifically. And so I'd be really interested in that. And Pastor Mays, that does not leave you out of the conversation. I'd be interested in your experiences as well. But I did want to come back to that. I did want to come back to that and just ask, as we move to the point in the conversation, which I'm sure many members of the audience want to hear, okay, so what do we do? How do we do it? What's going to work? What are some actions we can take? So I wanted to make certain to give some airtime to that. But Dr. Davis, I did see your hand a moment ago, so I want to give airtime to you as well. What was it that you wanted to add?
So I can respond to this question. What I was going to add is that, with the Affordable Care Act, one provision in it had to do with Medicaid expansion, and many states opted out because they did not want Obama to succeed because he was a Black man. And so everybody has lost because of that, because we now have rural hospitals closing. And that had implications in the pandemic, because if you didn't have access to healthcare and you had COVID and you lived in a rural area, you were up a creek. And it also has implications when you look at maternal mortality, which has been on the rise for 20 years. We have maternal deserts where there are no birthing hospitals, no OB-GYNs, no midwives. Part of this is a consequence of not expanding Medicaid. But Heather's premise about we're in a new moment, I certainly hope so. My fingers are crossed. I think we are in the infancy of this moment, and I hope it gains momentum. And my example of living the solidarity dividend has to do with the work that I did in the beginning of the pandemic, when we noticed that it had an outsized impact on our Black and Brown communities, on people living with disabilities. And so at the time I was at Boulder County Public Health, and what we did is that we launched vaccine equity clinics. And so these were clinics that do not look anything like a corporate clinic at all. And so I assembled a coalition of the LGBTQ community, NAACP, various Latinx organizations, Center for People with Disabilities. There were some other organizations, immigrant rights organizations, and we designed these clinics, and they were welcoming to everybody. And as a result, we were able to achieve vaccine equity here in Boulder County.
Mhm.
Now, where do we go from here? That's a great question. And it goes back to this whole idea of keeping the momentum, sustaining, building on the momentum.
Okay, and we'll come back around. We'll come back around. So Pastor Mays, Minister Glenda, is there anything you wanted to say about that? When, again, it comes to cross-racial organizing and the portion of Heather McGhee's book that talks about organizing and this resurgence of activism that she has identified.
So I just want to be brief. You know, I'm a historian, and so mine isn't happening right here in Boulder County. I want to cite two things that were life-changing for me. I grew up, as I said, in an all-Black, well, wasn't all-Black, but my hometown. We had the Jolly family, and the Jollies were the nicest. They were a white family that lived on the next hill. We didn't have neighbors, you know, the next hill, but they were the nicest people to us. They treated us, their children, Sylvia, Jimmy, and Patricia, were the same age as my sister Juanita and I, and they treated us exactly as they treated their own children. I'll never forget that, and I'll never forget them. And a few years ago, we were back up at the old home, and we walked up to the Jollies, and they were having a family reunion. And we just decided to walk up the hill. And Mr. Jolly was an old man by then. Mrs. Jolly was old. Jimmy, who was my age, had cancer. And I remember telling them we would pray for them. But to me, I said all that to say, that was an example of the beloved community. And they adopted children, and their children came from like Mexico or Venezuela or somewhere. They were just an unusual family. They were a part of our lives, and we were a part of theirs. The other was on the March 28th, 1968 March. On my left hand, I was holding hands with a Jewish rabbi from New York and a Catholic priest from Sacramento. So Jewish rabbi, little Black girl, 19, and a San Francisco Catholic priest, unheard of. But to me, that's the real example when you can put aside everything else that divides you and do what works for you. And we walked, and we were singing, holding hands, we shall overcome. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We have another question. Dr. King also talked about how economic policy negatively impacted the Black community. And so this questioner wants us to come back to the question regarding reparations. What if we talked about reparations in the context of providing compensation or some form of economic benefit as a result of property that was taken illegally from Black people? The indigenous community is asking for their sacred lands to be returned. the Japanese community asked for acknowledgement of the internment camps. And if I'm not mistaken, money was given to the families involved. Why is this so difficult for the Black community to achieve? So I will put that question out there to anyone who wants to respond. And again, if I don't see any hands raised, I will just select somebody to kick off that portion of our discussion. And again, it takes us back to reparations. And this question is asking more specifically, since there have not only been conversations, but land is being given back to certain Native peoples as we speak. Now, I'm not suggesting that has been accomplished. I'm not suggesting that will ever meet the needs, desires, and or what is just. When we talk about Japanese who spent time in internment camps, there were reparations for those Japanese men, women, and children who were interned. When we look at the Holocaust, you had not only the West German government that at least extended reparations, as well as the, what was that large act at the time? The Marshall Plan was also part of that. No one, and I am the last one to suggest that that has made up for or repaired anything. So that's not the suggestion. I think the question is, why has that conversation somehow fallen flat when it comes to providing reparations to African Americans? So that's the question. Anyone like to take a stab at that?
I'll take a portion of that.
Okay, thanks, Pastor Mays.
I think we have become a threat, and anything that we added to us now, I believe we've become somewhat intimidating, because we no longer just have a strong back, but we have a strong mind. And I think just one of the elements that stops the reparations is the threat of us being more capable, because the fewer tools we have, the less work we can complete. And so I'm feeling that there is an intimidation factor there. There's still within the white racism, that systemic issue is how can we give them something and still maintain control over them. That's where, and we were talking earlier about the cross-racial efforts that's put together. Many times we have to be so very careful that it's not cross-racial for the purpose of maintaining control. There's some things, when we look at reparations and look at cross-racial cooperation, I'll put it like that, many times we still are in the minority. So we're trying to look at the possibility of getting another seat at their table rather than building our own table. I think there is a threat that we may build our own table. We may build our own financial institutions. We may finally come together and outlive the Willie Lynch era and begin to know that we're strong enough mentally, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, as well as physically, to build our own. And that is something that I feel like is a threat to the economy that's been built, that's working exactly the way it was designed to work.
And I see that Dr. Davis has her hand raised, and it's an interesting concept. It's a conversation we recently had in one of my classes, in one of my ethics classes, when we were talking about reparations. I believe we had that conversation just last week. And I often wonder, when we look at the intergenerational trauma of Black folks, and we look at our history, if in fact any pain or suffering that we have experienced is lowercase p when it comes to pain. And sometimes the pain experienced by others is kind of an uppercase P. But nonetheless, Dr. Davis, please.
Okay. So I have been working in this area, as many of you have, for many years and decades. And my experience has been that my white colleagues really have a hard time giving up power, okay? I could list, I don't know how many people, and these are people that profess to be progressive, okay? They are progressive and they are all about equity. But when it comes to giving up power, that's where the buck stops. They will not do it. And so I'm asking the participants, those who identify as white, are you willing to give up power to let African Americans flourish?
You know, it's interesting, Dr. Davis, that you posed that question, because my next question to the three of you was what questions you had for attendees. Because again, you've been answering the questions that they have been directing at you, but I wanted to turn the tables and I wanted you to pose questions to our attendees, because I wanted this to be an exchange. And I believe that in any successful conversation, there is dialogue, that it goes both ways. So let's see what's coming up in the Q&A and see if you're getting any responses to your question. And if I understood it correctly, and please jump in if I misstated, but you were talking about power and you were talking about individuals being willing to cede power, and most are not. Or at least haven't been to, you know, what time is it? It's about 3:35, at least up until about 3:35 today, to be exact. So the question you seem to be posing is, are you, as white folks, and perhaps others, willing to cede power? So that's the question there.
And if I may add,
yes, please.
What would it take for you to be willing to cede power?
So let's see. I am looking to see if we have any responses to that question. You know, while people are, I'm sure, responding excited and enthusiastically, I do see, or I did for a moment, see a question that I wanted to come to, and let's see. It's gone away, so I wanted to respond to it. And it spoke to something in regards to women, and I definitely wanted to come to it, but I don't see it now. These questions have come up and they seem to go so quickly.
Karen Lockwood had her hand up.
Perhaps, but what I'm not seeing is her question anymore. It's not on my screen. And so I wanted to, I see the hand raised, but I'm not seeing the question. I have to look to too many screens. I think, if I'm correct, so I'm going to paraphrase here, and I apologize to the questioner if I get it wrong, because I only had a chance to glance at it and it's no longer on my screen. But it seemed to have something to do with women. It seemed to be a gendered question. I'm hoping, okay, let me get back in here. So, no, I'm being directed. So folks, bear with me.
Michele, that's was done by Sandy Reevy, and it is in the Q&A under the answered questions.
Yeah, and that's where I am.
Okay, good.
Okay, so here we go. Sandy, more of a comment than question, but you may agree or not. We off topic, but being a woman, I think some things mentioned also apply to women. We are getting more powerful. Look at the panel. And so our rights are being squashed too. I also grew up in Park Hill and went to Smiley and East. I feel I got a good education, but it brought up some re-examination of that for myself. I just wanted to say briefly, I'm not a panelist, but this question got my attention, and it got my attention probably because I'm a women and gender studies professor. And if we just look at Tuesday, let's look at the recent midterms and look at the fact that the bulk of white women voted for very conservative right-wing politicians. Let's look at the election in, again, 2016, and that Donald Trump was elected because white women put him over the top. So when we start to talk about gender, it's important for us to take and at least approach it with an intersectional lens and to look at it through an intersectional lens. And so again, this notion around women and solidarity with women, and I'm not suggesting that's what the questioner was posing, but I think it's important to get that out there, that it can sometimes be challenging to form cross-racial coalitions, because historically, and what I'm about to say may be stunning for some or controversial for some, but throughout history, white women have sold out Black women almost at every turn. So again, when we talk about truth and reconciliation, we'd have to begin the conversation there. And so having conversations regarding gender can be interesting, but they have to be truthful and they have to be rooted in the truth. And I'm at a place, and many Black women I know, and that's a small community of folks, are at a place where we don't trust white women. And we don't trust white women to have our backs, speaking to zero sum. And that whole notion that somehow when it comes to power, you will hold on to power or you're being power adjacent, come what may, and everything else gets sold kind of down the river along with everyone. So I just needed to say that because when I saw that comment, I just wanted to come to it. I wanted to, though, again, really open this up, at least the last portion of the time that we have left, to, again, our panelists' questions for you. And I'm still not getting that response that,
So
again,
I'm seeing
go
some
ahead.
questions around what would giving up power look like.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with, academia. If you are in academia, prioritizing hiring a dean of color and also supporting the success of somebody in a leadership position would be one way of ceding power, or a political office. Supporting the candidacy of a Black person. I know Junie Joseph won recently, and she had this multiracial coalition. That's an example of ceding power. Supporting the growth and development of African American leaders is one way of ceding power. So I hope that gives you a sense of what I'm thinking about.
Okay. I also have seen some comments and questions regarding the wealth gap. And that is spoken of in the Sum of Us as well. So there's a question here. Thank you very much for this excellent discussion. One of the greatest inequalities in the United States remains the tremendous wealth gap between white people and people of color. Following the theme in the Sum of Us, I'm curious to know some ideas the panel has in regards to ideas of how to educate our society that this inequality harms everyone. In addition, does the panel have any ideas to bridge the income divide? And I think, Sheila, that's where you were headed in the comment you just made, but if you want to say more about that, please do.
I'm so glad that somebody asked this question because I'm very concerned about the racial wealth gap. There are some economists that believe that African Americans will have zero wealth by 2050. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And what I mean by wealth is, your assets, your home, inheritance, stocks, small businesses, etc., minus debt. And so many African Americans do not have inherited wealth, and they may have debt, and they may not own a home. And so I know that our governor is all about affordable housing. I see that as one way of addressing this wealth gap, is to make housing more affordable in Colorado for people of color, particularly African Americans. But also, I love the idea of a baby bond. And that's in Connecticut now, that's in DC, where families below a certain income threshold that have a child, so much is given to that family and the wealth accrues. And so by the time the child's 18, they can use that to purchase a home or go to school or start a small business. These are all ways of addressing the wealth gap But then I think it also has to do with just creating more opportunities for people of color to thrive.
Okay, thank you. Minister Glenda, did you want to comment on that?
No, I'll pass for now.
Okay, no problem. How about you, Pastor Mays? Did you want to say anything about that in terms of the wealth gap?
Yes, I would love to see us close that wealth gap. I think one of the ways we can do that is that true cross-racial cooperation. I don't know if it's part of releasing the power, but the ability or the willingness to be in the background to support something. For instance, I'll give you just an example. A lot of nonprofit organizations that's headed up by African Americans, they don't have grant writers. They don't have that expertise to get grants. If there were those entities that do have grant writers say, you know what, I'm willing to not just write the grant for you, I'm willing to train another Black person how to write a grant, how to seek a grant, how to find wealth is what's really important. It takes money to get money. It takes wisdom and training to understand generational wealth. The difference between trying to be rich and trying to be wealthy is a big difference. And those are the things we don't, a lot of our communities don't have, those financial planners that are affordable, accessible. Even when you begin to talk about things like affordable housing opposed to accessible housing, it's affordable to who? You know, but I don't need them to give me a handout, just a hand up. I've got people who are capable of learning. Our community is saying we've got people who are capable of doing these things. We just need someone to give them that assistance that they cannot afford, that's not accessible for them, willing to cut the profit a little bit. So that, you know, yes, it's profitable. You are not a nonprofit organization, but cutting your profit enough to say, hey, I'm going to help somebody of color, so I'll take less off the top so that I can make sure that someone else has that opportunity to exercise that talent or that gift they have inside them.
Mhm.
I
Thank you
want to
very
respond
much.
quickly to the idea of a handout, because I don't see any of this as a handout. I mean, African Americans built this country. We created this wealth. So the idea of a handout, I'm sorry, it doesn't compute.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Pastor Mays, as well as you, Dr. Davis. There's a question here that's very interesting. So I just wanted to do this because we're getting a lot of questions now and I want to make certain to answer as many as possible. So let's call this our lightning round. Okay. So we will try to get to as many questions as possible. And if you feel like you can answer it, wave your hand or raise your hand with the raise your hand icon or wave it at me and I will come to you. So there's a question here that reads as follows. What are the panelists' views on young Black families choosing to self-segregate as a way to achieve community? Having the same location is not integration. True integration requires, I'm going to guess this is equality, I'm not certain, or equity. So I'm not certain reading it. So what are the panelists' views on young Black families choosing to self-segregate as a way to achieve community? Having the same location is not integration. True integration requires equity. I'm guessing is the word there, or equality. I'm not certain. But either way, anyone want to take a stab at that?
What do they mean by self-segregating? Move into an all-white neighborhood?
If I see self-segregate, I would see it the other way around. That's how I would interpret it, Minister Glenda, that these are individuals perhaps who are coming together and deciding to live amongst one another, Black families who are living maybe side by side or in a particular neighborhood or on a particular block. That's how I interpret it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. What was the question again?
And so the question is, these families deciding or choosing to self-segregate as a way to achieve community with one another, and then making the point that having the same location, in other words, living amongst, say, white people, again, this is my interpretation of the question, is not integration. True integration requires equity. So just living amongst white people is not, in fact, integration. Integration comes when there's true equity, is how I'm reading the question, and I could be misreading it.
Okay. Yeah.
Who wants to take that, if anyone?
Let me add to that. I thought Minister Glenda was going to expound on that. But let me say this, self-segregation, a lot of times we have to realize, both black and white have to realize, some people love their culture so much, they prefer that rather than to what we would call integrate and be a part. This is why we have to understand, when we're talking about the black race, you cannot look at it as assimilating into the white culture. We have a culture. We have a culture that we love. And some of us, we just want to be in a black culture, a black surroundings. And I don't see where there's anything wrong with that, as long as there is equity in all the facets that go along with it, where there's education, economic development, things of that sort. The equity has to be there. But I don't apologize for being black. I don't apologize for being half Hispanic. I love that. I love that culture. So I don't want to assimilate so that I can be integrated.
Okay. Thank you, Pastor.
And I want to add to that, Black folks created the village. We have that saying that it takes a village to raise a child. And it was born out of slavery and people being sold off and families being interrupted and just, folks dying, being lynched, all of those things. And so we created the village, to Dr. Mays' point, and we need one another. That's more than anything. If we are going to learn about our culture, we certainly need to assimilate with one another in that. On the other hand, we as humans need one another. We need to value each other individually as human beings. And again, that goes back to me, to getting ourselves together and putting ourselves in a position that we're all right. We judge one another and we say, yeah, no, that's not going to work for me. But to Dr. Mays' point, the beloved community was the thing. It's where Black folks wanted to be. We wanted to be with our own people, and we cooked and we fellowshipped and we partied and we had a good time. And I don't know that we will ever get back there, but it's a goal.
Well, thank you. Still in the lightning round, folks. I see that one of our attendees has provided us with a little info and inspiration here, and a reminder that Representative John Conyers in 1989 introduced HR 40 regarding reparations. It has been submitted every congressional session since he began this effort. Only recently it was advanced in Congress. And so again, this person who submitted this piece of information mentions that an activism activity, for anybody who's wondering what to do, what you can do, what you might do, an activism activity that we can participate in is to support this legislation here in Colorado. Okay, so another question, and
this may say a little bit about in addition to that. We talked about the threat and the intergenerational trauma and all of that. I just wanted to say, several years ago, some of you may have heard about the USDA Black farmers lawsuit. That lawsuit went on for years. Our families were very much a part of that lawsuit, and what happened was they gave certain families $50,000. Some of our cousins were privileged to get the $50,000 check. And what it did essentially was like the Willie Lynch theory. It divided the communities because certain families got it and didn't share it with the others. Our family did not get it because they said our father always had a job and he always did something. It was a good excuse. And yet they went out and sought Latino families, Asian families, and other ethnicities, and gave them the $50,000 rather than to give it to that community that had long awaited the periods to get that. And so somebody said it is a threat. Just the idea of reparations is a threat. So.
No, well, thank you for that, Minister Glenda. Thank you for adding that. I notice a comment here. Why not tax the wealthy enough so that we can boost the education, living environment, health, etc. of all poor people, no matter what color they are? This is the opposite of a zero-sum game. So I wanted to mention that. I also wanted to mention that we're getting lots and lots of really good suggestions for readings. And all of that, I believe, is being posted in the chat. And folks are also asking about how they can listen to the recording. And I noticed that a link will be sent to registrants once that is set up. And what organizing activities would be possible in the Denver Boulder area now? And I'm just going to put that out there as I put out kind of final remarks, final comments, anything that you didn't get a chance to say, anything that has come up for you now, anything that has been laying on your heart since we began this conversation, this exchange. I wanted to ask our three wonderful panelists to take the time we have remaining to do that. And we want to have a few minutes at the end to have Judy Houston, who opened this conversation, to be able to wrap it up. Okay, so I will start with you, Minister Glenda. What would you like to say? What are final remarks? Something you didn't get a chance to say? If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to do that.
I just simply want to say thank you for this opportunity. Every chance I get, I like to talk about the beloved community that was near and dear to Dr. King's heart. And so whatever we need to do to come together, I just heard last year, I think I was listening to something about Representative Jim Clyburn in his district. He got a special award because he had in the whole state a fish fry. And folks came from everywhere because folks, I know Black folks like to eat and like to come together. But this brought the entire community together for just a basic conversation of, you know, I care about you. I need you. We need to come together in whatever ways we can. And so we need each other. We weren't placed here to be alone. We were placed here to take care of ourselves and take care of each other. And so I'm looking forward to the day that we can move in that direction. Thank you.
Minister Glenda, thank you so much. How about you, Pastor Mays? What would you like to leave folks with?
I hope that, first of all, let me say thank you so much for an opportunity to share some of my experiences and some of my thoughts and insights. I'd like to hope that we, at the end of this webinar, the beginning of many more webinars, that we will understand that we're better together. I hope we can move away from the platform of us and them and begin to talk about we together can make this thing happen. The sum of us really helps us understand it hurts all of us. It hurts all of us. And I'm hoping that we can begin to wrap our mind around that and say, how can I be part of the solution? And not just spend time discussing the problems. I think all of us are aware of most of the problems that we have where white and black and brown and red and all of those are concerned, I hope that we can really search our hearts and see where can I be a part of the solution and understand that we can do this together, but it's going to take all of us to get it done.
Mhm. No, thank you so much. Appreciate that. Dr. Davis, giving kind of last words to you. The pressure's on, but don't feel any pressure. No stress. Okay.
Well, along those lines, let's start some kind of truth and reconciliation process here in Boulder County and invite faith groups to participate in that. I think that will help heal some of the trauma that we've discussed, but also moving beyond that to reparations. I'm not sure how to start that here in Boulder County, but I'd like for this to be the beginning of that, so that this is just not another conversation about discussing the magnitude of the problem. And to the person who wanted to know how to get involved in a cross-racial organization, the Poor People's Campaign, I always mention that, the work of Reverend Barber. It's a great way to work in this issue.
Okay. No, well, thank you. So again, Minister Glenda, Pastor Mays, Dr. Davis, from my heart to all of yours, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your time, your energy, emotional labor to be here today. And I'm going to pass this back to Judy Houston. So Judy.
All right. Well, I just want to echo the thanks to all of you for this amazing and just such an amount of thoughtfulness and care in answering all the questions, and proposing a vision for the future and everything. So thank you so much to the four of you, and to the audience members. Thank you for attending, and let you know that there will be a recording, and we will be sending you an email with the link to access that recording. And let's see what else is there. I would like to, at this point, ask Neil, and Neil was one of the organizing people behind this whole thing, did a lot of stuff on the tech work, and he developed the resource list. And I don't know if you've looked at that resource list that he sent out, but it's pretty exhaustive. He's going to share just one part of that, so you can kind of get an idea of, and this is along with the idea that we're not just having this discussion, that this is actually the beginning of something more, and that particularly within our individual congregations and or other kinds of groups that we might be representing here, that we discuss this more, so that in a smaller group, and find out what the next steps forward might be. So Neil, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and share that simple thing that you've got. Thank you.
I would like to take 30 seconds bully pulpit here. And I'm a Reformed Jew, but two of the most inspiring phrases in the New Testament. The second most is Matthew 25:40. As you have treated the least among us, so you have treated me. And I don't care what religion you're talking about, it's true. But even more important in this context, 25:45. As you have not treated the least among us, so you have not treated me. I think that is the big compelling question I have. We want calling out to congregations to continue the conversation as individual congregations or groups of congregations, and to do this before Martin Luther King weekend. And about that time, we hope to convene again and think about what each congregation thinks that they can do to move this big boulder forward. So quick slides. I'll just something really quickly. There's a lot of resources you saw on the link there, including a 12-slide summary. Okay, it's up there to download. It's a quick few minutes review of it. There's also the stories of solidarity. This is stories of success or partial success. There's wonderful resources up there. The link, you have it, and you'll also have the recording once it's available. Thank you, Judy.
That was very quick. So,
I can be quick.
and
It can
one
happen.
of the thoughts that, one of the things that I thought would be good for you to share, and I don't know if you can do this, was your quick synopsis of each chapter of the book, which I think was very useful and could be very useful in further conversations.
It'll
About.
take less than a minute. It's quick
Okay.
too.
Okay.
Okay, so this is 12 slides. And what they have is the first one is just intro, then the zero-sum story, then racism drained the pool, going without, that people have decided they don't need benefits as long as they give it to the colored people, ignoring the canary of what it came out. No one fights alone, how we need to work together. Never a real democracy, the foundation of our country. Living apart, and how that separation has detracted. The same sky. Hey, folks, we live under the same sky. The hidden wound that is carried by all. And the solidarity dividend, which is how we can do things growing together. The stories of solidarity here, quick, it lists 9 examples of how working together has worked from her tour.
Great, thank you. And it looks like here the questions keep coming in. That's amazing. Okay, so thank you all so much again. And I think this was a very rich thing. I encourage people to go back and look at the recording and to look at the resources that have been listed there, and the questions. There were a lot of questions that of course we couldn't get to once they started coming in. They started coming in fast, so that was great. Let's see what else is happening. Oh, I would like to put a plug in. If you are not already an individual member of the NAACP Boulder County, you should hop right over to the website and become a member. That way you will be kept informed of everything that's happening within the Boulder County NAACP. Also, there is an opportunity if your congregation is organized in such a way that you can do this. We have a congregational membership, which is a way for your congregation to help support the NAACP branch and to be in on the conversation on an ongoing basis. So just to put a plug in for that. And I think with that, is there anything else anybody else needs to say before we call it a day? Thank you again so much to Dr. Michele Simpson and to our panelists. This was excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, everybody.